Yeah, just raise your hand, keep them up just so I can see that everybody can hear me. Excellent. So we've got a really large group here today, and we just have 1 hour, and there's a lot of information that I want to go through. So I cannot turn on your microphones, but just to let you know, at the end of the hour, if you stay online, if you have any questions that you want to pose to me, and I will allow you to have that conversation with me. If you have issues during the presentation, you can use the question dialog box just to let me know. All right, so without further ado, I'm going to begin. You should all be able to see, so you can lower, here I'm going to lower your hands. Everybody should see on their screen a slide that's saying welcome. I want to thank you all for taking time out of, I know, what are very busy days to look at this question of who is the Agile Architect. So beginning this conversation is what we're going to be doing over the next hour. So my name is Christine Thompson. My email address is there if you want to take a minute just to record it. Of course, if you don't capture it at this point, you can always just contact WebAge Solutions and they can put you in contact with me so that if you do have follow-up questions that come after today, you can feel free to drop me a line and I'll do my best to help you, point you in the right direction. WebAge Solutions does offer a lot of comprehensive training for architecture, so enterprise, solution, software architecture. We also have certified TOGAF training, and this in addition to all of the other supporting work that architects and other technical disciplines would be interested in. So you can check out our website to review that. Now, for this presentation, talking about who is the Agile Architect, just starting with that picture now, raise your hand if you are currently an architect that is working on Agile projects. Let me just see how many in the group are in that boat. Thank you. I see a few of you raising your hands. So I'm probably preaching to the choir here that it's a very different world that Agile architects have to be in. They're different from all other architects. And two really kind of summary statements to talk about that would be that you're working in the existing traditional architecture practice. Like your architecture programs haven't actually changed, but now you actually have to work very differently, and you want those architecture systems to be able to address your needs as an Agile architect. I trust that you're in agreement with that. Really the focus then, the Agile architect is the person that's going to bridge the two worlds, and over the next hour we're going to see a little bit of how that happens. So out of today's webinar, I'm hoping that you will see 3 key benefits. One is that you're going to learn 3 approaches that are needed to be a good Agile architect. You're also going to recognize the main challenges Agile architects face, and in knowing what those challenges are, you can start planning on what you're going to do about it. And then also understand how to position your Agile project into the bigger picture, the enterprise context. So where does it line up with everything else that's going on? Because not everything is going to be Agile. Not everything is an Agile software project. So how do you make that connection is another thing we want to talk about in this presentation. So let's go ahead and take a look at who is the Agile architect. Now, raise your hand if you received the slide deck, that you have a copy that you can follow along with. Okay, so just a few of you. It is available, and a link for it should have been sent out with your invitation to register to the webinar. And if you don't see that link, please contact WebAge Solutions to get yourself a copy of the slide deck. But you can follow along on your screen here. So the question we're trying to answer is, who is the Agile architect? This presentation is divided into 3 areas. First, we're going to talk about attitude. So it's all about attitude. This is the foundational position that the Agile architect has to take, and let's break that apart. And then another thing is what I'm calling Knights of the Round Table, that while we always talk about architects needing to collaborate, the collaboration is really typically about how they collaborate with other architects. But when we're doing Agile architecture, we're going to see that the collaboration is with anybody that is involved in or impacted by the Agile project itself. And we're going to explore some of the details of that. And then looking at the big picture, that as architects, any kind of architect, our job is to really understand that we're building a piece of a puzzle for a larger picture. And how does that actually happen for Agile projects? So taking a look at this Agile stack for the bigger picture will be the last topic that we examine. So the first topic, it's all about attitude. We talk about thinking in Agile. So it begins with, of course, knowing the Agile Manifesto. You cannot be in an Agile project without knowing the Agile Manifesto. And one of the key things to be aware of is that the Agile Manifesto is not a methodology. It's a philosophy. And that we look at applying that philosophy to various software development methodologies. The most popular one out there currently for doing Agile work is Scrum, but there's also XP and other methodologies that take up a portion of that wheel. So often when you're looking at materials on doing Agile software development, it will be using terminology from Scrum, but it doesn't actually dictate it has to be this particular methodology. The main focus is whatever methodology you're using, you need to know the Agile Manifesto. All right, so this group of 17 that came up with it that said, here's the manifesto. So you need to know that. And that from that manifesto were principles that articulate basically what does that manifesto mean? How do we translate that into a working set? So again, well publicized. You can just Google these, give me the Agile Manifesto. You can see a page that summarizes it. Give me the Agile Principles. You can see a page that summarizes it. Now, to think in Agile as an architect, that's not enough. So know this and embrace it, but your key step that you need to do is actually the policies. You need to be able to have a set of Agile architecture policies, which is really the actionable steps that you're going to take in order to support fulfilling those principles. So an example might be that we have the principle of people over processes. So then we might have a policy or a collection of policies, but one example of a policy for that principle would be processes for acquiring technology should have no more than X number of steps and cannot take longer than X hours to reach a decision. So we need to craft policies. Now, part of the work to do that is to understand out of the principles which ones are posing the greatest challenges in your organization. So if you were to actually Google Agile architecture policies, you'll come across some articles, some forums that are exploring it, but there isn't a hard and fast set as of yet. It may be discovered over the next while as we mature this particular architecture style that we are able to say these are common across all organizations, but definitely you're going to still have policies that are going to be unique to your organization. So we need to take those principles and translate them into what exactly do we need to be doing in order to ensure we're actually fulfilling these principles. Now, the next thing is that, of course, we go from principles to policies. We go from policies to standards. Now, standards are going to support those architecture policies, and they're looking at sort of pointing us to the right kind of tools that we're going to be using, the right kind of platforms that we need. We're looking at not only ensuring that we get good results from our Agile project, but that that Agile project actually integrates with other systems. And this is where the standards come in. It's going to be the glue that ensures that we have a robust, high-quality system. So again, I'm going to be looking at the standard repository as an Agile architect to make sure that we've identified which ones we're going to be focusing on, because that will help constrain some of the choices. Now, in an Agile project, the developers are going to be, I mean, the whole idea of doing Agile is to be innovative, to be creative, that we've got a situation that is complex, that's unique, where we don't have all the requirements up front. These are characteristics of what would motivate us to do Agile. And we want to help, as an architect, we want to help set up direction for what they can be looking at that would be reasonable choices that would fit into the systems that we currently have and what we can do. Clearly, this approach is a paradigm shift. So yeah, we're leaning on some of the core things that an architect would do, which is like, I want to work with my principles and have policies and standards. But clearly this is stemming from the Agile principles, which is deviating a lot from the way a lot of traditional systems are. Now, the greatest candidates for benefiting from Agile are these larger, well-established organizations that do have the need for cutting edge and leading in the marketplace, wanting that innovation, but they in turn have the greatest challenges to actually fulfill those principles, because working in a traditional way is just not going to work when we look at the Agile principles. So it's the architect, the Agile architect, thinking in Agile that is going to challenge the traditional systems and work at discovering ways to then bridge that gap. Now, in addition to thinking, you need to do. Now, two key areas that we want the architect to focus on is to be flexible and to be adaptable. Now, it's not the only one. I mean, we could certainly brainstorm in a conversation what else do we want the Agile architect to be like, but these are two that are fundamental. One of the things about the flexibility, if you can see here from the first point, is to be a lot more innovative in how you're collecting sources of information to solve the problems. What we don't want from an Agile architect that might work very well in a more traditional architect is saying, this is how we do it, this is the proven approach, this is how we've always done it. Those kinds of phrases are basically prescriptive. And what we want to do is move away from a prescriptive approach to being more descriptive, in that we're discovering it and that we're not going to say no to ideas coming from unorthodox sources. So we really want to be flexible in our approach. And then that has us really saying, I still want to be a master of architecture techniques, but I want to be working with them as appropriate. So I'm going to be selecting, picking, and choosing, and I'm going to modify them to fit, not the other way around. We don't modify the team or the project to fit the technique. We change the technique to fit the project and the people. Being adaptable, notice this is really looking at reevaluating any decisions that you made as requirements change or new requirements come in. This is a big thing when you look at applying the Agile approach to methodologies, is the emphasis away from waterfall to iterative. So certainly, we saw the evolution of methodologies through the 90s, where we moved away from basically step 1, gather requirements, step 2, analyze them, step 3, build, design, step 4, implement, test, and done, where it was just one direction all the way. And in the 90s, methodologies came out that emphasize an iterative approach. So we're not saying that that's new, but now what we want to do is say that the iterative approach only iterated really between those phases that were side by side, Whereas what we want when we're doing things agile is at any point in time, new requirements can come in, because that's the real world, right? As we're working on it, we discover new things. So we want this to be able to, like the way we do architecture is to be responsive to that. So as new requirements come in, we want to be critical about looking at the decisions we made the day before to see, was that the right decision and what would have to change. Now notice then, as a result, when we look at our architecture, it's going to be made up of a set of evolving decisions. Now, one of the big discussions that's out there with respect to Agile architecture, you'll see some talk about it being evolving architecture or emergent architecture. And that can be a little bit misleading because it makes it sound like it's haphazard, that we're just flying by the seat of our pants. And clearly, if that were true, then we would just be amassing huge technical debt. The role of the Agile architect is to understand that that is one of the vulnerabilities, and we have to make sure that that doesn't happen. So yes, it's going to be made up of a set of evolving decisions dealing with the ongoing input of feedback and requirements, but we need to start from the beginning with the set, remember the policies and having the standards of knowing what it is that we can work with, and later in this conversation looking at that bigger picture and how we tie it back is going to help us ensure that the final architecture, while it came about over a series of decisions, was one that always had its root in something that was structured, solid, and planned. So it's basically intentional architecture that has that bigger picture to begin with, but the nuances of it are going to be modified to make it suit the particular requirements that are there. So we had thinking in Agile, we have behaving in Agile, and then the other piece is communicating in Agile. So an Agile architect is someone that knows how to communicate this way. So we begin with, you need to know the Agile team members. This is about people. Remember, like when you read that Agile Manifesto, when you read the principles, a big emphasis is around moving away from having people fit into boxes, but having the boxes shaped to fit the people. And the only way you can do that is to actually know your Agile team members, like on a personal level. Certainly we don't mean to be overly intrusive in terms of invading their personal space, but in terms of work, that we get to know what their needs are, how they work, and this is something that all Agile team members, this is not unique to the architect, but architects will be members of the Agile team and need to behave that way. So the other thing that the Agile team members don't have that the Agile architect has is that the Agile architect is going to be the one that's going to identify and establish a relationship with external stakeholders. So those that are not actually actively involved in the project itself, but are going to be impacted by it. So we mediate on behalf of the Agile team with those external to the Agile project. This is part of the balancing act that we have to do, is that we're still working in that traditional environment that's procedural and process driven, that has the structure, that is looking at approaching things in a particular way, predictable way, prescriptive way. We're not saying to throw all that out. We're just saying for certain types of work, it's going to be best handled in an agile way where we need to be more creative, self-defining, and being able to explore and innovate. And we need to be able to live in both of those worlds. And in being in both of those worlds, we need to know our audience and how to communicate with them. Now, another interesting thing that comes out in discussions about Agile is the whole business of documentation. Raise your hand if you've had the chance to look at the Netflix case study. How many of you have actually looked at this? I see just a few of you. Now, do you remember, I think just a couple of you, do you remember in there how the key architect the key architect was actually saying he didn't model anything, like he didn't have the documentation, and the way this was being expressed made it sound like documentation now is bad and it's obsolete and we don't have any for an agile project. So if that's the case, then it really does question, well, how do we actually have support for our architecture? How do we actually make sure we've communicated it? So it's not an all or nothing, it's just more selective. Before I continue on, I'm sorry, I just noticed a couple of questions. Debbie writes, does this conflict with the role of Scrum Master? So I wouldn't say that it conflicts with the role of Scrum Master. It's more that it supports the Scrum Master and bridges out beyond those things that are directly involved in supporting and working with the actual Agile project initiative itself. So it's meant to complement so that the Scrum Master can focus on the team and those that are sponsoring the project initiatives and making sure that they have that, and the Agile Architect is complementing it in a way that bridges beyond the actual scope of that one project. Does that answer your question, Debbie? And another question, thank you. Another question is, no, the Netflix case study was not sent out. I simply referenced it because if you've been researching and trying to see what companies have actually done, it's an interesting case study. In one of the courses that we have lined up for Agile training, we do take a look at that. But if you're interested ahead of time, I would just go to Google and go Agile Netflix case study, and there's a number of articles that are out there. One of them, I believe by Gartner, is an interview with Netflix to go over what was involved in them doing Agile. So it's an interesting read. If you want, you can follow up with me with an email and I can send you a link to one of such articles. Okay, thank you for the questions. Back to the communication. So when we talk about the documentation, we're modeling only to communicate. It's to validate and demonstrate the system meets the needs of the stakeholders. So it is really just a technique and tool. So this could be whiteboarded, where you're saying, this is what I'm thinking of. It could be something that, yeah, maybe you have, your Visio and you sit there and you plunk in some things and you can send it over an email to say to other architects or to other stakeholders, this is what we're looking at building. So it's meant as a communication tool. Now, the element that ties it back into more of the traditional practice is documenting to support understanding. So when we need to record what is needed for the support of the product releases, now that's where we actually do want something that is going to be, we can hand over. And this is where, going back to that example of the Netflix case study, it sounded like they didn't have anything like that would help those that are going to be supporting the production elements, that they wouldn't have the information at the ready that they could use, that they would, it's the idea that the release itself is the documentation. Well, we would still need to understand that the people supporting the operational architecture that is supporting the executable product, we need to think about how do they work? What do they need? Remember, people first. So yes, as an Agile architect, I'm going to respect what's going to be needed by them, as they would say, give it to me in this format, provide me the answers to these questions so that I can give the support in production for your releases. Now, whether that's the technical system admin type stuff, or whether that is for the business management piece of it, or whether that is for your enterprise program so they can understand all the different Agile projects and how they work to create the one product. Whatever those external entities are, the Agile architect needs to identify them and know them and give them what they need to do their jobs. When we do this documentation, we want to make sure we keep it simple and that we focus on content. So we're not trying to make this perfect in every way. It's meant simply, what information do you need? No more, no less. Good enough for now is something we want to be thinking of. Now, we do talk about this when we work just in our traditional, trying to curtail the need for perfection from architects, but this gets taken to another level. It's really start off with the simplest first. Is that enough? And I only add more if more is requested from that target audience. So I start with the very simplest, just basic content, and only add more detail if they request it. So let them direct the level of precision for that documentation. Now, with all of this in mind, this architect, like who this architect is definitely someone that is going to have more hands-on work. It's a very different way for an architect to work. We don't have, now mind you, what's interesting to me when I talk about this and work with this, in more of the traditional approaches, we talk about an anti-pattern called stuck in the weeds, where we've got the architect saying, well, now I'm the designer, and the same person who was architect is now designing is the one that's actually going to sit on the development team, and we say that this is not the way we should be doing architecture. Raise your hand if you're one of those architects where you're saying, I don't get to do architecture work because I keep having to go back to be a developer, right? Where you keep feeling pulled down into those lower levels. So if you're one of those that sort of resonate with the stuck in the weeds, you might feel threatened by this more hands-on work. Really what we're talking about is that it's about participating on the team and being sensitive to what they're doing every day. It's not to say, now it could be in your organization that you wear multiple hats, where you have the hat for being an architect and a hat for being a developer. And that may still be a challenge and an issue. But we're saying as the architect, it does mean that you have to get more involved in watching the evolution of this software project to making sure that you're capturing all the architectural needs. You also then have to take that information and align it with the traditional systems, and that's not necessarily easy to do. This is happening very quickly, and it does call to mind, do you know what the traditional systems are? Do you know how they work? And do you know the position that your Agile project will fit with those? And all this happening so rapidly runs the risk of building that technical debt. The pressure to produce immediately will have you saying, okay, I'll just get this out now and I'll come back and fix it later. That kind of mentality is something we want the architect to address, to keep it in check so that we can avoid increasing our technical debt. This is probably one of the key areas of vulnerability in Agile software, is that while you're addressing those unique concerns of the business and producing this high quality code, that it's done in such a way that the way in which it would integrate with other software, with other systems, and with the larger vision of the organization, it's got like huge gaps. So this is something that Agile architects need to be concerned about, and obviously it goes hand in hand with keeping up the speed of delivery. It's almost like sometimes you can feel like you're on a runaway train, and it's the architect that needs to control the speed of this train. They're the ones that need to create the environment to allow the creative minds of the developers working with the business to actually solve the business needs. We create that stable environment for them to be safe in their creativity, to ensure that at the end of the day what actually does get produced is the best quality product, not just for that specific scope of the project, but for how that project fits in with everything else, which means that you need to be maintaining that big picture perspective. So the Agile architect is someone who knows that big picture and knows how to translate it into making sure that we get that good quality project at a good speed without amassing technical debt. And to do that, you need to be more hands-on. Now I just noticed another question here. How does this fit in with governance review process like SAR? Well, definitely we are looking for having governance around our Agile projects. Ideally, you would have a specific Agile solution architecture that would have Agile approach to reviews, but it can't be done in the same way that traditional architecture has. I could, when we look at the next section, Jeff, I'm going to talk a little bit about how these more traditional approaches will line up, but the individual projects cannot be bogged down with large architecture traditional reviews. And that one of the training that we want to do is actually talk about looking at what the Agile governance would actually be. Another question here, does this mean that good enough for now isn't always good enough? Oh, absolutely. Thank you, Tom, for that. If it does increase technical debt, then the question is how is that technical debt going to be addressed, and why was that done? Because that's really sort of selling it short. And what the challenge is for the Agile architect. So if in meeting the pressure and demands of the time of delivering this has actually increased technical debt, then we would say that this is not a good product. And if our job is for a high quality product at the end, then I really need to figure out, well, what went wrong with this? Now, it may be that you say, for the sake of this one project, we accepted the technical debt, but it does require then a step back to go, well, why did that technical debt happen? What was wrong? What policy did we miss? What support were we missing? What environment change can we make so that the next project that comes along doesn't keep adding to that debt, and that we can then go back and correct it. So we want to minimize, but ideally avoid the technical debt. Now, good enough for now doesn't necessarily always mean that there's technical debt, right? So it's what were the compromises that allow you to say it's not perfect, but it's good enough for now. But it's not about adding technical debt. Maybe the good enough for now is really looking back to the requirements and saying, I know that you want all of those requirements, but which of the 10, which 8 are really more important? And so the good enough for now is acknowledging that some of the requirements may not be fully met in order to ensure that we get the best product out there, and that maybe on subsequent iterations down the road we can meet them. So the good enough for now, we want to sort of steer it more towards compromising on the business needs to get a more realistic goal, rather than compromising on the actual product itself, that we want the product to be good and not adding to our technical debt, which in the long term is going to be a worse situation for the business. Did that answer your question, Jeff and Tom? Okay. So let's, here we go. Next slide here. So this all brings in the fact that the Agile architect is someone who's going to bridge two worlds. The Agile architect has a balancing act to go through. And we're thinking about where do they find time. So again, we're looking at the organization. If the organization's saying we want Agile, they need to understand what resources it requires in order to get back what you want. Now, in one of the training programs we have, we look at the successes and failures to understand the patterns, the good things to do, and the anti-patterns, the things to avoid. And one of the things to avoid is this notion that if you have an architecture program, you're ready to do Agile. And that you don't understand that in order to get back the big checklist of value, like this rapid releases of high quality code, it's got to be sustainable. It's got to be giving you, when you say high quality code, that code has to exist as a product that works with others, and that takes a certain set of resources, and part of those resources is time that this Agile architect now, how thin can you spread them in order for them to be engaged properly with the various Agile teams? Another thing is maintaining the perspective that you're going to be really focused on this software project. So you're looking down almost like a microscope, but then at the same time you need to know that that piece that you're looking at exists in this bigger picture, right? So maintaining perspective. Another balancing act is the chicken and egg. Now again, not necessarily unique to Agile, but definitely a heightened sense of this, where you are asked for what is the architecture, and you can't tell what the architecture is without the requirements, but you can't, but the requirements come in over time. So which is it that's coming first? So without the requirements, the architecture can't be created. Without having some architecture in place, the work cannot be started. So which one is first? Now, really, to answer that question is, what we want is when an organization says we're going to do Agile is that they understand that Agile projects require an Agile architecture system. They need an environment which is going to support doing Agile projects. So that is the first thing that needs to be there. So then the Agile architect is working within a system that's there to support them, that they have the tools, they have the resources in order to support an environment that's very, very unique for their individual projects. And clearly this adds complexity to the role. So we think of, for instance, that an Agile architect will probably come from a background of being an application architect. So they know how to be a developer, they understand all the ins and outs of the tools, they've done designing, like being a team lead, that kind of background, and now they've moved into the application architect role. But then add to that, they've now got to understand Agile and how to think in Agile, how to behave in Agile, how to communicate in Agile, that they're traversing between these two different worlds. This picture is meant to speak to that. So it's the split identity. Now, clearly there's going to be some architecture practices, architecture work, where it invites the person who's definitely got a more structured mind, where they're thinking in terms of processes and procedures. And going back to one of the questions about how this fits in with SAR, SAR sits on the left side of this head, right? It's that very structured approach, very prescriptive approach to doing it, and that still exists. And we've got to make the translation between this creative world on the right, and isn't it beautiful? The green grass and the flowers and people painting and dancing and flying kites. We've got to create an environment that allows for that innovation and bridge the gap. Now, this is the architect. The Agile architect is responsible for these bridges, right? We don't expect the Agile software development team to exist anywhere but on the right. We don't expect our EA program, we don't expect the business as a whole and other architects and other technical disciplines like the system administrator to exist anywhere but on the left. And our job is to make sure the two have the right connections. I have another question that came up here, tool question. Some employers believe architects must be conceptual, abstract, and theoretical. As such, they don't allow architects to have access to systems or code and must rely on SME to provide necessary system information. For an architect to be agile, does this mean that there needs to be a shift in this paradigm? And the answer to that is absolutely yes. This is one of the big paradigm shifts. And the caution with making that shift, really, when you look at that traditional approach, we do that to ensure the architect isn't stuck in the weeds, because to do good architectural work, it is conceptual, abstract, and theoretical at some level, and we still are doing that. But in order to support that creative environment, I really need to see what they're doing and what's going on so that I can make the bridge, and so I'm going to be more involved. But I don't want to get stuck in the weeds again, but I definitely want to find to be able to shift into it where I'm getting the information directly from them and I'm interacting with them directly. So it is definitely a paradigm shift, and that's what's been missing in some organizations' attempts to do Agile and why they're not actually seeing the results that they had hoped for. Did that answer your question, Leo? Now moving on to topic number 2, entitled Knights of the Round Table. Leo's question leads right into this, and it's teamwork. So architects are one of many voices at the table, and actually when I've seen this at play, all I keep thinking of, I always go back to Star Trek analogies. Those of you that I've worked with before, you know how I think Star Trek. And I think of Picard, Captain Picard of the Star Trek Enterprise, and he's the captain, but he solicits input from all of the leads from the various departments for problems, but at the end, it's him that has the bigger picture. It's him that may have the communiques from command, and he's going to make the decision. But we're one of many voices, and we're seeking input from all members. It's interesting that you could actually ask the business team members, the developer team members, maybe operation team members for suggestions on what the architecture should be. This is part of that flexible thinking, right? Flexible behavior is that I want to get input from all different kinds of sources. Now, again, we can, maybe some of these things we can't act on, but we think they're good ideas, and we use, techniques like change cases for future planning. Another thing is like, and again, going back to Leo's statement there, inviting specialists on occasions when needed. So it's not to say that the specialists are there and they're the ones doing this work. We're there doing it, and we will appropriately call in different SMEs to help shed some light on different areas of architectural concerns, and also to support making sure everybody understands the strengths and limitations, because it's really architecture now by consensus. So yes, I'm responsible for it, but I need to sell it. I need to make sure I get buy-in. I need to make sure everybody is part of the process and everybody has a sense of ownership of this. So it's not basically give me the requirements, I walk away, I create, and I come back and I basically say, here's what it is, now live with it. It's me basically getting them to all have a sense that we're creating this together. And that's a really big paradigm shift. Involvement is going to be ongoing. Now, how you participate is going to be tailored to the team. So again, this is just going back to the way Agile says we should do this. So we're going to use whatever works to achieve the goals. And that it really is emphasizing the need to be supportive. You are there to improve the work environment to ensure the Agile team can do what it's supposed to do. Now, you're not going to dictate decisions, you're not policing implementations. Rather, again, if we've taken that architecture by consensus seriously, it's basically they recognize, while it may not be what they thought, they realize this is the best of what's needed when they understand, all the ins and outs of it. So we've been able to get everybody to go, yeah, I think this is the best option, so yeah, we're going to do this. Then it becomes self-policing. Then it becomes they're taking ownership of these decisions because they were part of that decision making. And of course, it is a shared experience. So again, thinking about the team, the Knights of the Round Table, we're meeting daily with them. This is where we're looking at things like user stories, epics, themes. Again, those are terms coming from Scrum, but you would have other terms given other methodologies that would speak along the same lines. Now, again, not unlike traditional architecture that may start with business use cases, and working with a collection of them, we can define architecture use cases. Do the same sort of thing here, but now again, these have to happen on a regular basis, like daily, like what are the new requirements and how does it impact or change the existing picture that we have. Now notice we're looking at, remember those consensus decisions, I want to get the feedback. I want to hear from them. Is the environment I created for you working? If it is working, what is working? And if it isn't working, what isn't working? So really trying to be responsive. So while the development team is soliciting requirements from the business and they have this ongoing relationship, the architect is looking at both of them to say, I created this environment for you to be able to do things in an agile way. Did I get it right? And I want to be tuning it as we go along. It's not about the idea that I built a completely wrong architecture. It's the idea that the environment we have can always be improved, and as we progress, I can make it work better. So analyzing new business requirements, which is separate from architecture, environment requirements, has me basically then looking at any of the requirements, what are the architecturally significant elements? And then analyzing and strategizing them. Are there any compromises needed? Now again, what I really want to do is make sure that I'm avoiding technical debt, at the very least minimizing it. So when we get new requirements in and we see compromises, is there a way to push back? Is there a way to sort of hold off in order to ensure that we're not amassing debt as we go? And really trying to get everybody on board to be realistic. We're level setting. So it can kind of feel like, if you go back to that picture of the head and how it's this free-for-all park, what we want to do is make sure that we understand the cliffs and have fences up. We want to, make sure that the water that you might want to play in doesn't have a bad undertow. So we're going to set some boundaries to where the creativity can occur. And so I have to examine the direction that they're going with these new requirements and try to be one step ahead, to run ahead and take a look at maybe some of the hazards and steer them down a path that's going to be safe. So then we have this notion of, I've been there on the team, I've been working with them, I've been hearing their feedback, I see the requirements and looked at the architectural issues that are coming up, and then I'm going to need to go out on these missions. Not all the requests are agile. So what would qualify something to be done in an agile way? I need to know that, so that I can say, no, you know what, that needs to be handled by a business solution. That's not really for this agile software project. There can be a temptation with the new and shiny to say everything has to be agile now. And we got to be selective. And then also really being that realistic is like, we have this much time and this much money and we need to make sure whatever we produce is good. So I've got to push back. I've got to mediate on behalf of the Agile team, and we've got to be able to get some of that input for where the compromises could occur. Just seeing another question coming in. Our infrastructure environments have a long lead time to procure and install. Any recommendations mitigating this? One key thing, Mike, for that is that one of the team members for Agile has to be somebody from operations. We need them to be made aware as we're making decisions here in the development environment. They're getting the heads up. So even without doing something like DevOps can help automate and handle and mitigate a lot of this. Just having a representative from the operations team sitting in on the Agile team, they don't have to be there all day, but definitely when new requirements are coming in and decisions are being made, we want them to actually be one of the voices at the table. Thank you for that question, Mike. Just throwing in a little bit of a shift here. I love this little cartoon. And again, this is really trying to assess that requirements and finding where the compromise is and what's appropriate. I don't know how many of you have actually seen this image, but saying they want a horse, but then what they're describing is nothing like a horse. So really trying to get down to exactly what it is that's absolutely needed. Again, this is one of the things that the Agile Architect is meant to bring to the team. We're to free the business people up from having to think this way. We're freeing the development team itself from having to think this way. We're coming in to be more objective and more critical in our thinking and analysis of those requirements. Again, thinking of constraining exactly what we're going to focus on in each iteration. So we're making that distinction in requirements not only between functional and non-functional, but the needs versus the wants, right? Having a more realistic objective. and that from that we're then identifying what the architecture user stories are, which is maybe another terminology would be like architecture use cases, but they would have a slightly different bent to be, more agile focused. Again, in the training, we look at actually maybe coming up with some templates for that to make it quicker and easier for Agile architects to do this work. And then, of course, working with requirements change management process. So when you look at Scrum or XP, they themselves aren't thinking of enterprise level requirements management, but when you look at things like LESS, SAFE, or DAD, they can help. Now, in this unit, and certainly in the course that it has, we don't go into that kind of training, but it's just a heads up on if you're in working on a product that's being done in Agile across many projects, you probably want to make sure you have a good framework to help support the management of the requirements. Now we have another question. If you had a business architecture practice in your organization as part of EA practice, would you see for an Agile team to collaborate with them? Oh, such good timing with that question, and I'm going to try to pronounce your name, Zahirudin. Maybe I didn't say it right. My apologies if I got it wrong, but that's a great question because that actually ties in with what I'm going to talk about next. So we need to know the enterprise architecture vision. And if we do have a business architecture practice, that actually would mean that they would be interpreting the business strategic vision and giving us things like a business capabilities model. And with that, we can actually then see what capability does the Agile actually fit in. So they would be articulating, we want to be more Agile in this way, and it needs to apply to this because we don't we expect it to be complex and that it's unique and requirements are going to happen over time. So a business architecture practice can be really instrumental in helping us identify really what out of the business is going to be the best Agile candidates. So you would be steps way far ahead if you did have that kind of work going on. If you don't, then it's basically on the enterprise architecture practice to basically fill in that gap. So we need to know what the EA vision is, and that in the EA vision, which is really what's going to be the architecture to fulfill the business vision, that we would want to know what part Agile is playing in the business strategy so that we can direct and validate our decisions, where I can basically go, oh, that requirement that you're putting in here to this Agile project doesn't really belong here, and I know that because we can look back at the business capabilities model and go, it's actually over here, right, where we work with the value chain against that business capabilities model to do that alignment. So it helps me filter the requirements and sort them out to know what belongs and what doesn't. Now, Agile actually requires solution architecture. So individual Agile projects are doing, applications, but they're doing it in an Agile way that says I need an Agile development environment. I need to have resources at the ready. What APIs, what frameworks, what IDEs, what standards are available? I should have a sandbox because as much as we can say we've tested these out and these are at your disposal, when we come into new situations, we're going, hey, what about trying this very new thing I heard about? So if I can have a sandbox to actually test out candidate technologies, I can be saying this is good for our situation and let's add it to the repository of resources that other Agile projects can benefit from. We need also the mechanism to support ongoing changes. So ideally this would be self-serve and would ensure timely action. So again, trying to step away from doing things in the more traditional, like how do we actually acquire these new things and going through these different reviews, that we've actually got some of this automated and that some of this could be self-serve, and at the very least that it can be escalated. The enterprise architecture has to set those things up, and it does that by giving us an Agile solution architecture. So is there a solution architecture initiative that's overseeing all Agile projects? What's common across all of them? What do they all need? So if not, then how as an Agile architect can you collaborate with other Agile architects to basically go, hey, we were using this and it works, so now you can try it out. So we can collaborate and coordinate between those. But ideally, we would have a solution architect taking the lead on doing that, creating that shared environment. And this is done before any Agile projects start. We're creating the environment in which to do good Agile work. And that Agile architecture system, that solution architecture for Agile, is going to obviously be over time as we use it. So we have the idea, just like with any other solution, is that we would have maturity levels that we would go through. So what do we start with? The basic, and as we start doing more Agile, the Agile architects feed back to the solution architect to say, hey, it would have been nice had we had this, or we had to basically escalate and mitigate, and that's going to be the norm, so can't we set this up in a more self-serve way? So incorporating that feedback from the Agile architects into the Agile system is what we want from solution architecture. And that means that they're going to be monitoring what we're doing and measuring it so that they know that the Agile system itself is working for Agile architects. So Agile work then updates the enterprise. So again, emphasizing the need. Now this is architecture evolves over time with iterations, emergent but intentional. Well, we have that notion within the project itself, but we should also be looking at the Agile system as one that the more we do Agile, the better the environment gets within our organization to do Agile. The better we are at identifying where the Agile opportunities are, the better equipped Agile teams are with their environment, the more efficient the Agile architect can be. So then the Agile architect can be free to focus on, well, what is the Agile vision? So now I'm looking at the project that I'm working on and I'm thinking, what is the architecture vision for this project? So before I actually know all the details, I should know what the product is. And when I know what the product is, I can at least have a high-level view of what it's going to be. So I can sketch out what that structure would be. Yeah, I'm going to be filling in the details over time. They're going to be resolved as we get more information. But that big picture sketch of it can be seen at the beginning when I know what the product is. So remember that we're trying to be fast, but you need to have a destination you're going to, and that destination is the product. And don't forget, we need to own the architecture, which means I need to know for this, with each release that I put out, what architecturally am I going to be watching for to know that I did it right? Because on the next iteration, I can contribute to that backlog. I can actually add in, you know what, I'm going to improve what we released as well as address this new iteration. So I am a stakeholder that can actually submit my own requirements. And then when we look at this, it comes back to the fact that while we've got this paradigm shift, while we have this Agile architect doing things differently, it still doesn't mean we throw away all the good things we know about architecture. The next couple of slides are really just looking at some of the things that just as an architect you would know. So you need to scope out and make available the best technology, tools, and standards to support the project, right? So get that done up front before you start. Get things at the ready. Also look beyond the application domain, right? It's not just the software. We have data requirements, infrastructure requirements, and that goes back to Mike's comment there. I want to make sure that I have representatives from those domains at the appropriate time, at least, if not as regular team members, to be able to make sure that they're giving the heads up about what's coming down the path. And then making sure we take advantage of patterns, proven ways to succeed at this. And again, one of the course trainings we do is look at patterns and anti-patterns. So what are they that are Agile specific? Continuing on, thinking of the what ifs. So we don't want to be focused on just this is the happy path. As an architect applying that critical thinking, I'm thinking about, you know, well, where do we need to have the checks in place? Planning for errors and failures. And again, this is part of making it robust. So ensuring that we're delivering in a way that's going to be high quality. And we're going to be considering both architectures. So as an Agile architect, I am the one that's building the architecture for the project, but I am using and contributing to the Agile system. If we have a solution architect, it means that I'm communicating with them. If we don't, I'm collaborating with other Agile architects to make sure that we're sharing our knowledge and sharing the resources that we create. Another big thing is identifying the components to buy or build, and you may have principles in your organization that you buy before you build. See, Agile teams are going to, as developers, are going to say, well, we can create it and we can do it. As the Agile architect, you could say, we've already got something that does that. So you focus on this other piece because we're just going to reuse this. So identifying those opportunities for reuse, and maybe also looking at selection criteria for different components. And when you do, then I need to look at the interfaces. So what is it that we're actually going to build versus what are we reusing or buying? And I'm going to be addressing the issues of how to connect these things. So who is the Agile architect? It's someone who thinks, behaves, and communicates according to the Agile principles. So you need to know them, and you need to have policies that allow it to be actionable. The Agile architect is someone who is involved actively with the Agile team, providing environment for fast delivery and high quality products. You got to be there every day. And it's also someone that knows the big picture and ensures each Agile project aligns with the vision of the business. You got to be building those bridges between those two worlds. So that's basically sort of that introduction to that conversation. Now, I had mentioned that we have some additional training in our curriculum that's coming soon, and two key ones. The unit we just went through touches on some of what we talk about in our how-to guide, and we also have one, improving results, and we mentioned a couple of things from that. Just coming down here, the how-to guide is basically where Agile is best used and how, what resources are needed, the relationship between the development team and architecture, and what the deliverables of the Agile architect is. So it's meant to be a how-to guide, 2 days, and it's basically intended for those involved in Agile projects to ensure you get your architecture met. And then the second course, improving results, which is focusing on how to be successful and recognizing and avoiding common pitfalls. So this one is looking at the patterns, anti-patterns, being able to diagnose issues and take corrective issues. And this is where we look at, well, what would be the Agile architecture governance plan? So how can we keep our Agile successful? And it's just 1 day, and the prerequisite would be to have done the how-to guide first or something similar. So we do have those training. And then in addition to that, we do have other Agile work, but let's just take a look. So we started out by saying that you would learn 3 approaches needed to be a good Agile architect, and the 3 are thinking, behaving, and communicating. So if you're an Agile architect, how well do you know the manifesto and the principles, and do you know how to apply them? In other words, do you have policies? And if you don't, start working on them. And start by looking at where are you having the problems. So what principles are posing problems? Come up with some actionable steps that can help mitigate it. Behave in an Agile way, which means you're collaborating with everybody. In other words, it's not just architects collaborating with architects, it's the Agile architect collaborating with the Agile team as well as Agile architects. And you got to be flexible and adaptable. You can't be thinking this is how we do it. You got to be thinking about how should we do it? How could we do it? And that we communicate in an Agile way, and it's people first, and you only model with the goal in mind. Recognizing the main challenges, 2 that I'm putting in summary. 1 is the fact that you have to actively work with the development teams, working with their feedback and managing continuous requirements. And you're producing architecture quickly. So these have to fulfill the requirement, and you have to have it so it integrates with other systems. And that in this conversation, we wanted to understand how to position Agile projects in the enterprise, and it really comes back to what's the EA vision, right? Where does it fit in the strategic goal of the organization to be Agile? And then we have to work with the Agile system. So does that mean we're building it or we're supporting it? So where is the Agile system? Know that it's needed. And also then, in our Agile project, what is the vision? So I need to be able to articulate the product up front on that first day. And the product is going to evolve. We're going to discover its nuances, but the main picture of it's going to be known right at the beginning, and what its value is, because the value of it will actually point me to what the metrics should be that I'm going to measure so that I can monitor the success or the areas that need improvement. We also have at WebAge Solutions other architecture training, and there is also other Agile architecture training. One is the Implementing Agile Architect, which is about building the Agile system, that solution architecture. So I want to thank you. I went over time a little bit by a few minutes. Thank you everybody for hanging in there. Felt like I was rushing a little bit at the end because I'm sensitive to the fact that you no doubt have other work and other meetings to go to. So I appreciate your patience with this. Again, my contact information is up there. You can always get a hold of WebAge Solutions for more information about all the other training. And I'm really excited about this maturing the work that we've got there to be able to collaborate with you to get the most out of this new approach to addressing particular needs in the business. So that's the end of the presentation. As I said before, I'll hang on to see if there's any of you that have any other questions. Those of you that have to rush back to work, I hope I hear from you soon. So thank you all. So just raise your hand if you have a question and I can free up the mic, or you can use the question dialog box. Okay, if there aren't any other questions, I'm going to close the webinar. So please raise your hand if you do have a question. Okay, so I'm going to end the webinar. Again, you can always email me if you think of a question later. Have a good rest of your day.